Hello and a very warm welcome to moneycontrol.com. It's a day where BJP has made history once again in Gujarat, and we have with us one of world's most distinguished economists, Professor Dr. Arvind Panagariya, former Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog and Professor of Economics at Columbia University. Dr. Panagariya has done extensive research on the Gujarat model. He's one of the first people to have done in detail, in-depth studies on what is it that distinguishes Gujarat from other states. Dr. Panagariya, let me begin by asking you: were you expecting this victory for Gujarat, for BJP in Gujarat, and what is it that defines the Gujarat model? What is it that distinguishes it from other states?
Thank you, Shweta. Really great to be with you. Let me first say that obviously in the recent victory of the BJP in Gujarat, the Prime Minister's personal popularity was supreme, and this is one rather exceptional case where all the exit polls also turned out to be right, So this was a victory foretold, and it did play out as it had been foretold. Multiple factors always apply in any election outcome, although in this case, the Prime Minister's popularity was at the forefront. Now, having said that, let me also say that, ultimately, prosperity is there for everybody to see. And when something good is going, you don't want to part with it. And I think the voters saw, because, if you look at what has happened in the last 10 years in Gujarat, there has been a phenomenal growth. Indeed, Gujarat turns out to be the fastest growing state after, I think, Mizoram or something, just one of the smaller northeastern states. But really, if you take the larger states, Gujarat, it grew quite exceptionally at about 9.4% per year annually. And the only state that comes close to it is a full percentage point below it at 8.4%, Haryana. And the Kerala model, about which we debated so much during 2014 election, did very poorly, at just 5.7%.
Wow. Yeah, that's true, because very often the Kerala model is cited in terms of showing development, especially in the human development context. But if we were to go back to Gujarat, any specific reforms, Dr. Panagariya, that you feel have had a very strong impact in driving prosperity? I was in Gujarat last week. They're working on a gift city, which many people had written off. Even now, there are a lot of naysayers around it. But whatever work that's happening in Gift City seems very forward looking. So, and while I was talking to a few people, they were explaining to me how water was one of the problems that Prime Minister Modi tackled head on. So, any defining schemes or any defining policy moves that you feel have been instrumental in driving this growth in Gujarat?
Yeah, so Shweta, in terms of policies, I have not looked at closely enough. In the recent years, I did study Gujarat very closely prior to about 2012, when Prime Minister, the then Chief Minister, Mr. Modi, was coming to the fore as the prime ministerial candidate. But I imagine, well, there are two things to say here. One is that ultimately, the policies that really matter come from the central government. It is the implementation which varies across states. And Gujarat is very effective. There is something about, when you look at the states, something about the bureaucratic traditions. And I get the sense, also having visited one or two times, talked to the people there, that the bureaucratic tradition in Gujarat, I think, is very different than, let's say, from my own state in Rajasthan. That bureaucracy works. it's quite amazing to visit. Even when I was at the Niti Aayog, I visited there, and the bureaucracy was really on top of what was going on. They had their own databases going all the way down to the village level and all. So it's very much data-driven policy making in the state, in Gandhinagar. So, that I think plays a very important role. The second thing I was going to say was that a lot of good policies that get adopted always pay dividend with a bit of lag, and presumably I'm inclined to think that even some of the things that the Prime Minister had done while Chief Minister, about which I wrote, they had to do with industrial policies. Outreach for foreign investors, the summit that he used to do annually and all. A lot of the things pay back with a lag, and that effect perhaps is also there in some of the early years of this last decade.
The state also attracted the highest FDI in the pandemic year, 1.62 lakh crores. In your interactions, sir, what's the sense that you've gotten from the investor community when they are looking at India as an investment destination? What is it that attracts them about Gujarat that is driving this prosperity and creating jobs in the state?
Yeah, so it's a general environment, and as I said, the state level bureaucracy is extremely important. Ultimately, right, the country is chosen based on the country's policies, which is the national policies. But to which state to go, that is a function of how the state level bureaucracy functions. Because in the end, every investor has to deal with basic things like acquisition of land, the electricity, water, and for that, the state government and the functioning of it is very important. So Gujarat in that, stands out, and the sufficiently long standing tradition. Also, the general Gujarat community, it has a tradition of very good business environment, and so after all, the investors also have needs that are related, ancillary industries and all. And for that, the environment in Gujarat happens to be quite good. We know, for example, that the special economic zones in Gujarat practically account for about 1/3 of the exports that go out of these zones India-wide. So, one state accounting for nearly 1/3 of the exports of India-wide special economic zones. I think that really says it all.
It's fascinating. Talking about the culture of entrepreneurship in Gujarat, while I was there, I was talking to people, and they were saying that people in Gujarat don't want government jobs, which is very unlike what you see in states like Bihar, where there's a long queue of people waiting to apply for a job, in the police or in the armed forces. But that's not what happens in Gujarat. It has probably the least number of people who join the armed forces, are from Gujarat. So this whole culture of not wanting to work, not wanting to do government jobs, they say that they want the government to be a facilitator. Yet, what we've seen in Gujarat is, and this is something Prime Minister Modi has tried to implement at the center level also, of minimum government, but maximum governance.
Right.
He's managed to do this successfully in Gujarat. Can you throw a little bit of light on that? What's been your observation on this entire the slogan and the practice, how it was implemented in Gujarat?
Right. No, I mean, this is something I've said already, Shweta, that bureaucracy sees itself as being there for service. And not for entitlement, and that at least now I'm an outsider, so the view from inside may be a little different, but at least my own view from outside, especially as the vice chairman of the Niti Aayog, when I visited there. It was very impressive, that all the kinds of things they were doing. I visited some of the projects that they were doing on transportation and all, how even at that time, 2016, was the year. And on guiding all the traffic and all, there was a centralized control room from which they could really see the movement of this bus and everything, and everything works. In terms of the public projects, I visited the Sabarmati waterfront, the Kankaria Lake, and all, and very well managed. Very well managed, where fees should be charged. They were even charging fees and all, small ones, because public places, you don't want high fees. But that allows you to keep the place running well and being clean and maintained. And that really was the general sense.
So they've taken some financially unpopular decisions also. They decided to move away from the old pension scheme, something that helped them save money, and direct those funds towards other areas. Their fiscal deficit is about 1.2%, which is lower than what has been mandated by the RBI. So despite taking these tough decisions, they managed to change the narrative. Because while I was there, that roti, kapda, and makan is no longer and are a priority in Gujarat. Even for that matter, jobs. I feel that's something that is a recurring theme in many parts of the country. I felt that it was not such an issue in Gujarat, which is fascinating. I wanted to get your thoughts on the old pension scheme. You have been, there's the election rhetoric has been around bringing in the old pension scheme. Aam Aadmi Party promised it. Congress Party has promised it. Government workers in Gujarat have been unhappy about about the government doing away with the old pension scheme. Do you think that, first I want your thoughts on it, and then second, with the budget around the corner, I want to ask you, could the center government be tempted to introduce or reintroduce the old pension scheme?
Okay, so lots of questions there. So I hope I can keep track. First, I wanted to actually comment on people not wanting the government jobs, and that is indicative of the prosperity in general that has come to Gujarat. Where your incomes are growing at 8-9% a year. In real terms, that is where you want to be. Even the government jobs may give better salaries and all, but the future prospects look much better for the people from outside. So I'm not surprising at all. And this roti kapda makan is history for Gujaratis. If you look at per capita income levels, they are now among the highest. They're probably below, among the larger states, they are just a little below Haryana only. Then we are talking of small states like Goa or Delhi or something. So Gujarat now, has moved up 4 or 5 places. It was below Karnataka, it was below Tamil Nadu, it was below even Uttarakhand and all 10 years ago. But it's all history. I think Gujarat is now at practically near the top, with Haryana, and with the price differences between Haryana and Gujarat, probably in real terms, it might even do better. So that's the thing. Now coming to the pension scheme, this was implemented actually by consensus across entire country. It was recognized that the old pension scheme was eating up the budget, and every year it was the share of the pensions in the government budget had been rising because life expectancy had gone up, was continuing to rise, and so those on pension were living longer, and pensions would rise also with your age and all. So my own father, probably when he passed away, his pension income was in real terms was significantly higher than the full salary that he received at the time he retired, and that's true, of those who retired in more recent years also. So the fiscal budget, the fiscal burden of it promises would have actually turned us into Brazil, which is spending currently about 12-13% of its GDP. on pensions. No country can bear that. After all, ultimately the bureaucracy is maybe 2% of the population, 2% of the workforce, and you cannot tax people and transfer that kind of money. And this is also intergenerational transfer, because
Right.
those who retire, it is a young who are employed today are paying for the pension of those who have already retired. So, and for the state governments to do that, actually, you can see why they want to do it, because then they do not have to collect the taxes. I mean, it's two things that they have to make about 10 to 14% contribution currently in the new pension scheme to the employees' pension fund. So they won't have to make that contribution. So they actually come out winner on their current fiscal budget, and the burden of the pension will shift to the governments that will come after, let's say, about 2034, because
Right.
the scheme was introduced in 2004, and those who will retire, those who started their jobs in 2004 will retire 30 years later in 2034. So you're shifting all this to the future governments,
Right.
and gaining in terms of today's intergenerationally. You are really holding future generations. Basically, they will have to pay for the retirement of people who are employed today and will retire after 2034. So that's, in every way, this is a bad thing to do. And very risky thing to do, a very irresponsible thing to do. This is the reason it's unconscionable for any government actually or any political party to make such offers and try to win elections based on that. They are not doing any favor to the people at large. And people who are distanced from it may not understand it, but the fact of the matter is that it is that they are really hurting those people, because ultimately they will pay the taxes, which rather than being used to do public projects and infrastructure projects and all, will get used to be transferred. When you're basically taking money from somebody's pocket and putting it into somebody else's pocket. That is not the right thing to do. Unless there is a compelling reason, like for poverty alleviation, we do that. That is a good way to do it. So I think this is all very irresponsible. I certainly would be very, very surprised and be even more devastated if actually central government one day gets tempted to do that. The present central government, as you can see, will not do it, as revealed by the fact that in Gujarat they did not make such an offer.
Right.
And so I think certainly the presence, I mean it's a very responsible government, and I think generally central governments, by the way, even within the Congress party, responsible leadership actually has not come out to favor going back to old pension. I recently saw an interview by Mr. Chidambaram. So in effect, he said that I'm not going to say much more. He said that, well, I introduced the new pension scheme and I did bring the legislation. I brought the legislation which on pension regulatory authority and all. But he said, I'm not going to say much more because I'm bound by my party's discipline. Which basically means that he didn't agree with a move to old pension scheme, but because the party leadership had decided such, he was being responsible party leader. But it's clear that he certainly did not come out and said that I support this movement back to the old pension scheme. So even actually, the responsible leaders within the Congress are not endorsing this.
Interesting. Responsible leaders in the Congress party are not endorsing it, though it was there in the Gujarat manifesto.
Yes.
Both parties, both parties had it.
Yes.
When we talk about responsible leadership and responsible decisions that are fiscally prudent, we're just barely 2 months away from the budget. It is the last budget before the Modi government goes in for general elections. And in the last two budgets, there has been a lot of talk and discussion around whether the government needs to spur consumption by putting money into the hands of people. So, do you feel, Dr. Panagariya, that now is the time for India to maybe think of a scheme like an urban Manrega, or something that will spur consumption, that will help, that will essentially just give that feel good factor? Or do you think that India is in a very safe position and the government does not need to resort to such populist measures?
Yeah, I mean, quite the contrary. We need to get back to fiscal consolidation. And that, of course, means restraining actually government expenditure rather than stimulating it further. The consumption demand is returning as far as I can see. The data are showing that. Investment demand, by the way, is also very robust. Now, we have seen the investment as a proportion of GDP rising, very clearly rising trend over the last several quarters. Current level is about 34.5%, so that's fantastic. So no, I would actually not recommend the government kind of trying to raise more expenditures, and certainly not in urban Manrega. My goodness, that's a permanent program. As you can see, Manrega got started. The normal philosophy of these things is that whenever there is drought, you do these kinds of programs. But we have made it a permanent program, and that is not a good use of the resources that get taken out of the economy. I think, if you want to give, if on poverty alleviation reasons, if we needed to give, we should have had simple cash transfers so that the people go and use their labor on productive activities rather than these unproductive public projects, So certainly, we need to be restrained. But let me also say that since you raised the question of the budget itself, it is time for us to also fix up the personal income taxation system, simplify that quite considerably. Very much, like what we have done for the corporate profit taxes, we need to end all the exemptions, or most of the exemptions anyway, and simplify the system. It doesn't matter, if revenue is an issue, they can start out with 4 or 5 tax rates. Today you can make the tax tables, the computers do the tax calculation and so forth. So the kind of a reason that used to exist for having only 2 rates or 3 rates in the past is no longer true, in my opinion. The computers can do all the calculations once you have simplified how to calculate the taxable income itself. So I think that needs to be done. A higher education reform, which has been pending for 2 to 3 years, needs to be brought back to life also. And I think, we also need to put back the privatization of public sector banks on the budget again. Yet, this should happen. It should be on the government's agenda. And likewise, the privatization of public sector enterprises, for which there is a policy now, for both banks as well as the public sector enterprises in general. There is now a policy in place which was brought out by the government itself now, which separates out the strategic sectors from non-strategic ones and all. So I think all this agenda needs to be pursued, because we are in a good position right now. Economy is growing. Given everything that we know today, I have no doubt that we will continue to grow at 7% plus, but we can do better. And we should also, continue with our free trade agreement negotiations. Ultimate goal ought to be to finish within 2 years some sort of agreement with the European Union as well.
Okay, Dr. Panagariya, is inflation a concern for you? And is considering how inflation is impacting small business owners, the kind of impact it's happening, it's having on those at the grassroots level, is that something that you think that the budget needs to address aggressively?
So inflation is not a budget issue, Shweta. It is a central bank issue, and the only way the budget can help is through fiscal restraint. You see, Ultimately, one cannot say that we need feel-good consumption on the one hand, and on the other we complain about inflation. These are two, in a way, contradictory kind of forces. So, if inflation is a concern, then what the fiscal policy ought to do is to have a fiscal consolidation plan in place, and even coming in for the coming year, as the budget is presented, it should give a clear signal that this government is now moved. So fiscal consolidation should begin with this coming year. That is what the budget can do. Or on the other hand, is a big concern? No, to me, inflation. I think we were impacted very much by the external factors. They are mitigating now. In the United States, finally, we are seeing signs of recession. Might some, at least, a lot of job losses are not taking place. Also, while total employment still remains robust, of course, in the US economy. So there may still be a little time there. But the external factors are mitigating now, and therefore I'm not so worried about our own inflation. In fact, the RBI now ought to think seriously about whether it wants to continue on the current path, because interest rates, when you raise them, they get transmitted to the borrowers rather easily. But when you reduce the interest rates, there is some lag with which this transmission happens. So therefore, there is an argument actually that while raising the rates, keep in mind that when you start the opposite cycle of reducing rates, the transmission is going to be slow. So that ought to factor into the decision-making process of the central bank.
Okay, so you're saying inflation is not such a concern for India. I just want you to zoom out a little bit. You look, we look at the U.S. economy, you look at the U.K. economy, and the news that we've been getting and the indications that we've been getting is that there's an impending recession. So one tends to worry, sitting in India as well, that the impact will be felt in India. What's your view, and what's your view on the India story at this point?
Yeah. In fact, look, I read it very differently because for now, I don't see that inflation. The recession in the U.S. economy is right around the corner, because even though tech firms are laying off many workers, numbering in thousands, the total employment is remaining robust. Actually, on net, it is still increasing in the US economy. But should some mild recession happen, that is not a bad news for India. That, I would say, actually is a good news for India, because that will then put a restraint on the interest rates. And so the bit of the capital outflow that is happening out of India and putting pressure on the rupee would be ameliorated. And that is therefore a good thing. Also, from inflation point of view, the external factors will then become less important, or at least they would stop contributing to the domestic inflationary pressures as well. So in this sense, and as far as the export markets are concerned, for us, the problems are internal, nothing external. It's a very, very large market, $22 trillion exports in the year 2021, which was still a COVID year, and that was a rise from the previous peak, pre-COVID peak of about 19 trillion. So, we expanded global economy. As far as the export opportunities are concerned, there are plenty of them. You need the takers. It's not a problem of lack of export opportunities in the global economy. It is the problem of takers. You need Indian entrepreneurs to take advantage of that very, very large market.
Any specific FTAs, Dr. Panagariya, that you think India should pursue aggressively, from which Indian exporters can benefit?
Well, one is underway, which is UK, and we ought to really complete that. One thing we need to understand here is that, look, our own liberalization is good for us. It's not bad for us. Look back from 1991 onwards, how much we benefited. Exports used to be a pittance. Merchandise exports were hardly $50 billion in 2002. And within 8 or 9 years of liberalization, they went up to 300 billion, sixfold. Nothing else actually expanded as rapidly as our exports during that period. So, our own liberalization is a good thing for us. And if we go in with that attitude, we can very aggressively seek market access. But the big FTA, to specifically centrally answer your question, that
Mhm.
we need to conclude is with the European Union. That is the large market.
Mm.
And unless we really, open up ourselves to the large market, there's not enough game going on. And this is really the most opportune moment, because ultimately, when multinationals are looking for China plus one strategy, what are they going to look for? I mean, we
Right.
got everything else. I mean, India got the necessary size, it got the skilled labor force that many of the multinationals need.
Right.
All the other ingredients are in place, but they have to be able to export out in a frictionless way. And if we have free trade agreement with such a large market as the European Union, I think that would be a big plus.
Mhm. You mentioned about asset monetization, privatization of private sector banks. That's been a recurring theme with the Modi government, but success rate has not been as stupendous. Air India has happened after many years. Any advice, any recommendation on how they can push this privatization, asset monetization agenda through? Also, there is a possibility that they might actually go slow on it because it's 1 year before elections. So it's not a very popular move. Unions, there's a pushback from the unions. Do you think there's a possibility that they could take a step back? So what would be your advice?
Yeah. Look, there are many enterprises where unions are not a threat. If anything, what I found in my experience at the Niti Aayog is that it is the ministries who push back harder than, and the folks who are actually running those enterprises who push back harder than the unions do. I mean, even on Air India, I remember that the worker union that came to see me at the Niti Aayog, basically, they were not so opposed to privatization, but they, basically wanted that, look, our health, please see to it that our health insurance and health benefits are preserved. So in a way, if the ministries will play it well, and in any, particularly for many of the enterprises that are not doing well, even unions understand that, in the private hands, the enterprise will do a lot better, and therefore their own workers will do a lot better too. And they have the experience to see for themselves, of the privatizations that have been done in the past by the Vajpayee government.
Right.
Virtually all of those enterprises are flourishing, have flourished over the last 20 years. So I don't think that's a big issue. So at least some of the enterprises which are easier to privatize, and at least also the sick enterprises that are doing nothing, close them
Right.
down. I mean, there's nothing that is something that needs to be done. So if election time, if the timing of the election is an issue, there is still ways to do things where this will not impact in any way the election outcome by proper choice of the enterprises. But also, the finance ministry gets worried about this issue of, in the current environment, will we get enough value for the enterprise that we are selling? I don't think that is that ought to be a big issue. Because ultimately, look, these enterprises are our enterprises. These are not government's enterprises. These are people's enterprises. And as long as the enterprise actually eventually begins to grow much faster, the
Mhm.
country benefits. The distribution, who receives the benefits of it is a secondary issue. The primary issue really for the country as a whole is whether or not the enterprise flourishes. And we know this, that enterprises, once they pass on to the private hands, they flourish much better than they have any chance at all of flourishing in the government hands. That is ought to be our, that ought to be our consideration, not that, are we getting enough value and all, because otherwise there is never a good time to privatize anything, because you can keep waiting till the cows come home. So I would say that let's not get hung up on that particular consideration. The political aspects of it, yes, I think, that's something obviously every government is going to have to worry about. And particularly, if the government wants to return and do a lot more privatization, it cannot afford to lose the election in the first place on that count. So that part I totally get it. But I do not think that is a factor, at least, in terms of sick enterprises that have to be privatized. There's plenty to do. Asset monetization has no issue. There's no worker issue there. So that can be done as more speedily as well. So there's plenty of room, I think.
Okay. My last question to you, Dr. Panagariya, what's your outlook on the Indian economy? I know you're you're optimistic about the India growth story. I want to understand, where is your optimism stemming from, and what's your outlook?
Yeah. Well, in my optimism broadly is being supported by the outcomes that we have been observing. I should say that I was predicting 8% growth for this second quarter. On that one, it didn't come out my way, as the economy grew. I mean, still decent growth, 6.3%, but it was not to 8%. And largely that's because none of us actually thought that manufacturing will come out -4% or something like that.
Right.
So I mean, I was expecting at least manufacturing will still do about 4% or 5% growth. In which case, my 8% forecast for the second quarter would have, in fact, turned out to be true. But be that as it may, reason I'm very optimistic is that there is a very well-functioning government at the center. It is reforms oriented. I have huge hopes for because of the Prime Minister himself. Because one thing one can see, and hardly anybody disputes, is that the Prime Minister really wants to take the country forward, and as fast as possible. Nobody can question Prime Minister's bona fides on that particular dimension. His one-point agenda is to take India forward, and I think having a leader like that is a good enough source for me, at least, of both optimism and inspiration. So I think that's a big factor, which means that the reforms will stay and they will continue to happen. Obviously the Prime Minister has to judge what is a good timing for the reforms. So in my mind, it's never the issue that whether reforms are going to happen or not. It's only an issue of timing, which he chooses strategically. We know that, so that is fair enough for any Prime Minister. Rather than be a one-term Prime Minister and do a lot of reforms, it's better to be a three-term Prime Minister and do a hell of a lot more reforms and risk a government which ultimately might stop doing the reforms, as happened after Vajpayee government, 2004 to 2014, 10 years, we lost as far as the reforms were concerned.
Any growth estimates that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I've said this, that, under the current, if we stay the current course, probably about 7 to 8%, but that is well below our potential. Our potential is 9 to 10, but that requires aggressively, embracing the global economy. I think, on that front, we have gone back a bit, as I've said it in many different forums, that look, the recidivism in liberalization and actually returning to protectionism, that is a big mistake. And it takes away from some of the positive reforms we have done. But, I think I'm a sort of more or less a lone voice on that. Industry loves the protection that has been given to import competing interests. It's sort of really, to me, it is very inexplicable. At least in the US, you see that the export interests are very vocal and they want open markets. But in India, even the export interests never come to the table. They are never pushing for liberalization. You would think that at least export interests will be as vocal as they have been in the United States for many decades. I think, the in the US also, the export interests have in recent years become a little less vocal, because a lot of them are invested abroad. You see, when you have a automobile factory in India, then you
Right.
don't want Indian market to be liberalized either. That's a problem. So the multinationals have progressively, because of these cross investments, have become less of a voice for liberalization. But that's not the case for India. For not for the Indian exporters. And the Indian exporters ought to be actually more. Particularly when it comes to the free trade agreements, etc., they ought to be at the table and providing the counter force to the import competing lobbies. I mean, that is how these negotiations always work in countries like the US and European Union, that, import competing interests are always leaning against liberalization, but export interests which want access to the partner country markets in these negotiations provide the counterforce. But in India, these export interests somehow never come to the table. I think they work from different channels or what have you. But at the end of the day, in the FTA negotiations, both with the United Kingdom, European Union, it is the export interests which ought to be present at the table.
Absolutely. No, actually, the protectionism is hurting specifically the small business owners, because they just find it cheaper to be able to get something that's made from another country. But because of these import barriers that have come into place, their cost of raw materials has gone up. It's hurting them, but their voice is not reaching the powers that be. That's I think that's where there's a gap between. Between the policies that are being implemented and
No,
people's
but look, Shweta, you got some of the big corporations. I mean, remember one thing, that
mm,
the bulk of the exports are done, bulk meaning 80 to 90% are done by the large firms. We keep saying about, there is no evidence, but
mm,
complete lack of evidence, and yet everybody keeps complaining, keeps claiming, oh, how
mm,
micro and small enterprises are big exporters.
mm,
They're not. I mean, where is the evidence? In fact, Praveen Krishna, my friend at Johns Hopkins, a very eminent trade economist who has looked at the numbers at the firm level, these export figures. He tells me that, 18 to 90% of the exports are coming from a very, very small number of firms, incredibly small number of firms.
right. but
Where
but
where are these firms in the negotiations that happen for FTAs? They ought to
yeah,
be present. So
yeah,
so why will they not be heard? I don't think. I mean, I don't buy the argument that their voice is not reaching.
or
Uh, uh,
maybe they're not being honest about it.
well,
That's not.
well, they are simply not lending their voice to this. I don't know what the
Mm,
reasons are. I mean, I won't second guess whether it's not probably
yeah.
issue of integrity or anything, but for some inexplicable reason,
Mm,
they seem not to voice their own interests in these negotiations.
mm. Okay. Well, we do hope that budget 23-24 sets India's agenda for the next decade. And we do hope that your optimism for the country continues to grow. Thank you very much, Dr. Panagariya. Always very insightful talking to you. It was, thank you very much for your time and for joining us all the way from New York.
Thank you, Shweta. Pleasure, my pleasure.
Thank you, sir.